All right, so I'm in a text group with some digital pastors, and one of them sent a graphic along. You guys will appreciate this. It's a photo of a couch, and the headline says, "Church on the sofa will never be the same as church in a sanctuary." And so the premise here, and it's funny, a digital pastor posted it, and then the other digital pastors, they're all boo and memes and gifs of like people booing it. And it's funny, my response was, well, God, I hope not. I hope what's happening in the physical building is not like what's happening in digital space. Because if physical is the same thing as the couch, then we're wasting the opportunities we have to reach a different type of person. Now, this was abstract thinking, and I don't think the other digital pastors in the text group really maybe appreciated it. And we'll get a chance maybe to talk with them later about it. I feel like there's something brewing as a future episode. But it comes down to this heart of, we can do something different digitally than we can physically. Because if all we're doing is the same thing, then we're really wasting the opportunity to reach a different person digitally. This is one of the reasons why I love this idea of helping people find personal mission. Established churches have struggled with this. And honestly, the calling and the mission of an established church is so big, they really don't have an opportunity to nuance, to get into the relational aspects of helping people find their spiritual gifts, their talents, their abilities, and helping release them on personal mission. And this is where I think digital churches can shine. This brings us into the conversation here, because if I'm working a digital only church and I'm trying to understand how to get people on personal mission, who am I going to learn from? Who's doing this real well? And the answer to that is Rob Wegner with KC Underground, Kansas City Underground. Now, if you're not familiar with Rob, he's been on the podcast, man, I would probably guess 3 or 4 times at this point. So a great guest here, a longtime guest with the podcast. But in this conversation, we really want to get into personal mission. How can the church equip people, not for purposes of the brand, but to help these people understand what their personal mission, what their calling is, where God may be leading them? And then how can the church resource them to go and do what God's calling them to do? Now, we talk about this all the time in context of digital only churches. We've talked about church as platform, multiplying out. We've talked about disciple makers who are witnessing to other disciples, who are creating other disciples, and the multiplication part of it. You've heard me talk about Seth Godin, and if we really want to reach the world, it's a matter of telling a small crowd, make the message as simple as possible and make it specific for a group of people, and then ask them to own it and tell someone else. So the idea of personal mission, if we're really going to be effective in the months and the years to come, is huge, which makes this conversation so important. Now, personal mission is key. Rob, we're also celebrating. He just published a new book, co-authored a new book, Starfish and The Spirit, with a number of other people. We're going to talk about that in the show as well. But it comes down to this idea of how can we create decentralized movements, decentralized networks of churches digitally. How's it done physically? How are they equipping? How are they resourcing? How are they training physically? And then let's take some cues from that and start to figure out. We talked about this even back with Dave Ferguson. The relationship between a micro and a digital are very close. Microchurch and digital church are very close. It's just the view of community. Community is different between the two, but the opportunities to network, to multiply, exist in the same space. So here's who we're bringing into the conversation. We're bringing in Rob Wegner, Kansas City Underground, of course. We're bringing in Chesley Lundy, lead pastor from King City Church. Now, King City is another digital-only church. Chesley's been on the podcast too, recently talking about through Stadia. He's planning his digital-only church through Stadia. So we had him on maybe a couple months ago talking about that. Rob Wegner, talking from a micro church. Chesley Lundy, trying to adapt this micro church strategy and do it within a digital-only expression church like King City. And of course, I'm coming into the conversation myself, Jeff, with the Church Digital and Stadia Church Planning, in a conversation that I'm calling the Starfish and the Spirit, helping people find personal mission. Okay, everybody, here you go. Rob, tell us a little bit. Tell us about Starfish and the Spirit, right? Like where'd this premise come from, and why should people be reading the book?
Originally, I was influenced, as was Lance and Alan as well, by a book called The Spider and the Starfish by Ori Brofman and Rod Beckstrom. And Ori is a professor at Berkeley and a very intelligent and curious and thorough academic. And he had noticed kind of this pattern of leadership that was deconstructing another form of leadership. In other words, if you consider something like Napster, right? And what did Napster do to the traditional recording industry, right? It collapsed it overnight. And you could make an endless list of those examples where this form of decentralized leadership that's driven more by a DNA and distributed power and influence, a very micro power can actually take down a very mega hierarchy quite quickly. And we've seen so many examples of that in the last 20 years in our culture. So Ori wrote a book to basically give a guiding metaphor. The spider is decentralized leadership, and it's hierarchical, it's top down. And a spider, has a head and a body and legs that radiate out. And there's a starfish. And a starfish and a spider look a little alike from a distance, right? But if you get up close, they look different. And then underneath the surface, they're dramatically different. So with the starfish, if you chop off what looks like its head, you end up with two starfish, because everything that is required to reproduce in the starfish is in every cell of the starfish. And I read that book when I was on a flight to India, and I was a part of a disciple-making movement that became an incredible church planting movement with literally hundreds of thousands of new disciples of Jesus and thousands of microchurches. And when I read that book on the plane, it was how they say a nomadic experience, I think it is, where it was like traveling with Jesus to India, him helping me understand in a deeper way the type of leadership. And it became sort of an obsession for me, and I'd say for Lance. And of course, Alan, with his work in the Forgotten Ways, it's clearly this form of leadership that is required to see a movemental form of church. So that's kind of the origin story. And what's crazy is I read the Forgotten Ways on the same plane ride as I read that book. And now both of them ended up contributing to this book. And at that point in time, I would have never imagined something like that would have happened. It really is like a dream come true. Like, is this happening? This is real? I'm talking to Ori Brofman and Alan Hirsch, and they're both involved with this book. So that's kind of the backstory, brother.
Forgotten Ways. That's an older book, right? I don't want to date you. I'm sorry, but
it came out the same year as Ori's book, 2006.
Yeah. So, it's been 15 years. And that's, even in book age, I think that's a long time. Like, what brought about this new way of or this fresh way of thinking, or going back to this old way of thinking? Why write the book now?
Well, for me personally, it's since I read that book, it's been this 15-year journey to say, okay, I'm experiencing this form of the church in India, but why? At that point in time, I lived in Indiana. Like, why not in Indiana? I was in a very successful mega church, and began to basically experiment, repent, iterate, and saying, how do we get back to this more primal form of disciple making, primal forms of church, and keep reproducing what you could call sort of like nodes of power in a network where it's spreading out further and further and further. And I kept going deeper into the world of disciple making movements and church planting movements in places like Africa and South Asia. And I started leading my teams inside of the mega church this way, and kept seeing more and more joy, more and more authentic community, more and more flourishing, more and more multiplication. And so I just kept going and learning and trying to find the best practitioners I could find here in America. And eventually that led to what is now the Kansas City Underground. And Kansas City Underground is a decentralized network of missionaries and microchurches and networks of thereof and hubs that support the missionaries and the microchurches. So my personal motivation, first and foremost, is like I was writing this book as a handbook for the Kansas City Underground, for our leaders, for our elders, for our hub teams. But I've learned along the way, when you do things in a more open source way, where you're not just creating a resource just internally, but to actually be shared with the world, it catalyzes more learning, actually. As you share it, you get new insights. As you think about how you have to describe this, not just to your crowd, but to the larger world. So for me, it's like, I need this for the Kansas City Underground, and why not share it with the rest of the world at the same time? And honestly, I got invited into it. Lance and Ori had worked for probably a year or so before they invited me into the project. And, when Lance asked, it was, I think I prayed for about, 2 seconds, and then I was like, yes. Ori, yes. Okay. Because I was a super fan of all of Ori's work, man.
Obviously, you started talking about Napster and how that was able to basically disrupt the music industry. And I'm reading Starfish and the Spirit with Ori, and then reading your book, Starfish and the Spirit. Do you think that the prevailing systems that digital has basically rediscovered with crowdsourcing and with these like file sharing with Napster has allowed a paradigm shift for this decentralized leadership piece to take place? I guess a bigger question would be like, would it have been possible if that stuff didn't already happen?
That's an amazing observation. There's this interesting relationship between the church and technology. So if you think about when Jesus was walking, first century Palestine, and then the church is launched after his ascension and the coming of the Holy Spirit, there was the Roman road system and a messenger system that allowed for a global spread of the message of the good news of Jesus Christ. And then you think about the printing press, Gutenberg's gift to the world, and that worked hand in glove with the Reformation. And I feel the internet is part of what the Spirit of God is doing in the world. Like, I think God is working through every sector of society, including technology. And there's fancy words for this. Like, one of them is called a morphogenic field. Like, in other words, ideas begin to collate or congeal or emerge at certain times. And it'll be people who are distant from each other start perceiving this possibility at the same moment. For example, there were multiple people who created telephones all around the same amount of time because the technology had built, and there's enough people that can do this sort of evolutionary thinking to go, oh, this is what's next. So the reason I bring that up is here we are at the greatest hour in the history of the church. Most people don't know that or feel that here in the West. But outside the Western world, we have the greatest disciple-making movements and church-planting movements in the history of the church. And simultaneously at that moment, we have the greatest distribution of information and equipping that has ever existed. And it does fundamentally emphasize a different form of leadership. And it makes possible the Starfish decentralized leadership in a way that is now multiplied, I don't know, by a factor of what? What is it? You can't even put a number on it, by 1 million. And so I do think right now we're at this transition moment in history where not just the church, every form of like complex hierarchical leadership is actually crumbling in one way or the other. And it's being deconstructed one way or the other. There's a book, it's called The End of Power, which was very informative in actually writing this book. And the whole thesis is there's these emergent of these micro powers that are decentralized They form around a shared idea, a small set of practices. You can start making the list of what those are, like Al-Qaeda, there's positive and negative forms of this, and they can't be controlled or stopped. And they're kind of taking apart some of the pillars or foundations for the mega powers. And we're in this sort of in-between state of having grown up with like kind of the era of corporations, monolithic corporations, for example. And it's interesting because there's like an accumulation of power by those mega powers, but at the same time, the micro powers are multiplying. And the internet is basically the perfect force multiplier for that. I feel like I'm waxing eloquent. Is this helpful at all?
I didn't want to talk on this all day long because I do want to shift into digital churches, but you set this up really well. So, I mean, essentially, organizations are deconstructing things. Things are breaking apart. There's this tendency for things at this point where systems are becoming decentralized or pushing themselves more towards decentralization. I don't want to put words in your mouth. Maybe I did, but it was somewhere in that realm. When you have conversations with pastors, leaders towards this, I'm just curious, like, what's the knee-jerk reaction? Are they, yeah, you're right, but are they like, you're crazy? What's the average reaction that you get when you have these? I mean, you wrote a book literally on this, so they know who you are, they know what you're about. Do they like run away when you start walking up to them to go hide, to go talk to somebody else? Like, what's their response?
Well, I would say there's been a similar experience to what I think you guys in the digital space have experienced. Whereas a couple years ago, there was, what we're doing with decentralized leadership, missionary formation, Microchurch, decentralized networks. I think a lot of church leaders saw that sort of as a novelty. They saw it as an elective, like, yeah, it's maybe something you can add but it's not really, central or truly important, or a lot of them thought about it more as like a new method or a technique. Like, oh, maybe I can add, microchurches and reach a few more people that way. What COVID has done is it's changed the conversation completely, where people have begun to understand how fragile actually the centralized form of church is. And what happened in COVID was, well, you had basically two possibilities. Like, you're in the digital space or you're in the microchurch space. And I think what people are discovering is, yes, there was a kind of a cultural, pragmatic reason to explore these possibilities. But as they begin genuinely exploring them out of desperation, there's been more and more church leaders that are realizing, at least in my experience, it feels like the number of church leaders who are now looking at this conversation, they're looking at it as an essential conversation. They're looking at it as it's no longer novel, it's necessary. And with the microchurch conversation, I think there's more and more pastors who are looking at the scriptures again and realizing maybe the New Testament really is the story of a disciple-making movement that produced a microchurch movement that spread across the Roman Empire. And this form of church that we do, it really is extra-biblical. That doesn't mean it's wrong. But this other thing of like decentralized networks of microchurches, maybe that really was what the church started with. And that small groups aren't the same thing. And I think there's a similar discovery happening in the digital space, where people are beginning to understand the level of community that's possible in that space exceeded what their expectations were, because they were forced to go into the digital space and spend a year and a half in Zoom, which they would have never done, and realized, wow, I can actually have community out here. I can actually have, we can equip here. We can, there's so much more presence than we thought was maybe possible. And then it basically educated the entire world how to get into the digital space. And at the Exponential Ventures recently, one of the guys quoted a statistic, which I'm going to need you guys to help me find and cite. But it was like, I think he said 17 or 18% of the population spends more than 50% of their time in a digital space versus a physical space. Do you guys know that statistic?
No, I don't remember hearing that, but I can do some digging towards it to find out.
Well, that was convicting to me. It was like, even if I have like a physical missionary in that person's neighborhood or network, they're never going to connect with them there, because they come home and it's like they're getting, let's say they're a gamer. It's like, I'm home, I'm gaming the next 6 hours, and all my social space is there. So if I don't have a quote unquote missionary in that space, we won't have a gospel presence there, and I admit I was kind of, I forget who it was, but when he dropped that quote, it was like a light bulb went on. I was like, whoa, that's like 300,000 people in Kansas City.
It's only going to go up too.
It's only going to go up. So
like my kids are 6 and 7 years old and spending most of their time. And we try to like say, hey, no, you got to go outside. You got to play. But it's like, no, Minecraft. So it's just going to go up.
You've been using a lot of digitally savvy words. By the way, I've always felt micro and digital was a very similar strategy, if not the exact same strategy. It just looks at community differently. Community being the neighborhood, the zip code at a micro, digital, micro focus, but in different nuances within it. So, hearing nodes of power and a network being described for a decentralized micro, man, I feel the same thing, and I know Chesley does in a digital context. Which, and I really just would love to spitball here for a little while. Rob, you've got some vision for what you think, what you're now understanding maybe as a result of just ongoing conversations. 17, 18% of people spend 50% of their time in digital. Man, maybe we do need to do some churches in that space. Chesley, man, you're literally launching a network of churches. You told me recently, I almost feel like a network, or just connecting these people together. So both of you are experiencing some of this digital church happening. Tell me, and I just would open up for both of you guys. What is a decentralized digital church network, movement, insert adjective? What does this even look like?
When COVID hit, when we were in total lockdown, none of our microchurches could meet in person. So we basically upgraded our Zoom account and said to every missionary microchurch, you have access to a Zoom room. And what happened is virtually all of the microchurches, there were a couple that didn't make the transition for various reasons, but almost all of them basically transitioned to a digital space where basically through their phones, through their laptops, they began to connect. And what was interesting is like our microchurch, and this happened with a number of the microchurches, like we had a rhythm of, hey, about twice a month, we're going to have one party, and then we're going to have something that's about serving in our community, kind of two expressions of mission or out. And then we always have we got to have a couple, what we call in expressions. So for us, it's like, hey, meet with your coach or be a part of the equipping gathering. So you're connected to the larger movement, you're being supported and you're connecting with eldership, that kind of thing. And then 2 up is like in your microchurch family, meet at least twice a month around a meal, a table for discipleship, engaging the scriptures, prayer, planning for mission. Like, what are we going to do for our outs this month? Well, most of the microchurches went to meeting every week for an up. So it doubled actually the number of up meetings. And for our microchurch, it immediately deepened the community too, because we're in this crisis pandemic where there's so much fear and anxiety. And then we also noticed like the connecting in, the equipping gathering, same thing. Missionaries who were coming once or twice a month, now we're coming every week to the equipping gathering. And then the number of missionaries we ended up equipping has just gone because we moved our equipping into a digital space. We then sort of by accident started equipping missionaries all over Kansas City rather than just in the west quadrant where we're located. So I feel like we've been living there for a year and a half, and now we're sort of coming out of it. And what we're deciding to do with our equipping gathering is we're going to do an in real life gathering probably once every 6 weeks. But the point of it will be more about worship, prayer, kind of like what you could call sort of like prophetic activation, a chance to sort of hear the voice of God together and commission each other again and be sent again. And so we're going to continue with the equipping online, because now we're reaching people all over the city. They're not all going to drive an hour to go to a physical location for equipping. Like, we'll keep that online. But, once every 6 weeks, they might drive somewhere. Like, I want to be with this whole gang, and we're going to worship Jesus together. We're going to ask the Holy Spirit to fill us again, and we're going to be sent and commissioned, and we're going to hear from God together. You see what I mean? So I feel like the Lord used COVID to transition us into that space, man, whether we wanted to or not.
Chesley, what are you seeing, bro?
I think the biggest opportunity that the church hasn't quite figured out yet is the power of influencer marketing. And I believe it's the new frontier for missions in the church. And this is what I'm trying to do right now, right? So I'm going out, I'm starting a podcast, I'm getting on social, I'm beginning to make aware who I am, not for the sake of my own fame, right? So that's the largest difference between an influencer marketer and an influencer missionary is we're not out for our own fame. We're out for Jesus's fame, but we're going into these sectors. So for me, it's young professionals in business and using the influencer marketing platform by building a personal brand and then funneling them into a training like what Rob does with Kansas City Underground, so that we can disciple them. I know Brian Phipps and Rob, you guys have followers made with this, disciples made and missionaries made, leaders made. So we're using that same system to build disciples, but then launch them out to become missionaries in their own context. My little brother plays with 7 guys online every day for 2 to 3 hours a day. They play Call of Duty. They just went a couple weeks ago. They went to you'll like this, Rob. They went to Table Rock Lake in Branson, Missouri, right down in your area to go. Nice. They call it is. They call it Fishopolis, and they go and fish together. So I think what the church, the physical church, hasn't quite understood is that digital relationships lead to physical relationships, but physical relationships don't necessarily lead to digital engagement. And so we have to reconstruct the way we do this. And I think one of the best ways to do this is what you've seen Carrie Newhoff do, what you've seen, Charlie D'Amorillo, I can't even say her name well. She's a Gen Z. She's getting ready to be a movie star. The top 4 or 5 most famous people that Forbes put out the last year, they're all YouTube stars. Like they're not movie stars. So if you're not online, you don't even know who these people are. It's not like the old days. And so I think there's an ability for church people, for people that are Jesus followers. I don't want to say church people, Jesus followers, to harness this influencer marketing piece, create awareness. There's a force multiplier that Rob's talking about, but what if you could do that all over the world? What if I can bring 1,000 people that say, yes, I want to start this thing, but I don't know how, together digitally, train them to do missional communities or micro churches in their neighborhood and support and unleash them. Now I've got a whole digital hub without a building because I created the personal brand first. Man, that's good. You're going to go wild just because you're online. But it's a new way of thinking. It's a new paradigm. So that's the stuff that I'm working on right now. That's why I've got my Lead Full podcast. Why I have what I'm doing is because I care about finding those guys that have this missional discontent, I think is what Rob said when I was with him a few weeks ago in Kansas City. Find those guys and then unleash them in mission and giving them a system to do so.
Wait, Rob, you were with Chesley a couple weeks ago in Kansas City?
Yeah.
You didn't invite me? What? I don't understand.
The whole team came, man. We had a good time. We ate barbecue and we got into it, man.
We got to do it like we were supposed to, like right before COVID hit, or right when COVID hit. I think it got canceled as a result of COVID. So we're gonna have to. Have to.
I gotta get to Nashville. We can have Nashville barbecue. It's not as good as Kansas City, but it's still good.
No, it's not. That's okay. Sorry, Nashville friends. I love you out there. Chesley, I love what you're saying as you're talking about, that the influencer and the influencer marketing, and that it's very close. Maybe it's a sister to really this idea of personal mission, helping people discover their personal mission. Just even this week, there was one of my old blogs I wrote back in 2018 somehow resurfaced and went viral, and like the line that has popped up out of this that people are really freaking out about, which I wrote 3 years ago pre-COVID, but it's simply church online works best, not when organizations do ministry, but when churches empower others, when they empower people to do ministry. And people are like, oh my gosh, you were thinking this way back in 2018. I was like, well, of course I was. Like, that's how we should be thinking. And evidently now, I guess post-COVID, as people are going back to the building, there's this subsector of people that are like, hey, maybe we should actually like pay attention to this personal mission stuff, which, Rob, I know through what you're doing with KC Underground, there's nothing new here. And even in digital spaces, guys like Tyler Stanza, who I just happened to have an hour-long phone call with today at First Capital Christian, Corey, Indiana, like what he's doing digitally as well is really championing this idea strongly. But tell me, like at a micro, because I really want to dig in here, because I think the future of church, if we're really going to be effective, it gets to this place of helping figure out how to help people find personal mission. So, Rob, like what learnings, what understandings at the micro level, at the physical level, what does this look like for KC Underground?
Yeah, we have a team that's called the Personal Discovery Team, and it's there to help everyone discover their Ephesians 2:10 masterpiece mission. And so the vision of Ephesians 1 is gospel saturation. We join Jesus, and we want to see all that Jesus is fill everything every way in Kansas City. So the way we describe it is our mission is to fill Kansas City with the beauty, justice, and good news of Jesus. That can't be accomplished apart from all of God's people being mobilized God's way. Like, you're not going to do that with a program or 10,000 programs or bricks and mortar, quote unquote churches with services. Like, you have to get into every corner of culture, every sphere of society, and activate someone there, like who has come alive to their masterpiece mission and realized God has called me to this sector. I'm called to media. I'm called to education. I'm called to healthcare. I'm called to, fill in the blank. There's thousands. There's these major domains, but within them, there's thousands and thousands of these like niche causes and pockets of people. And what we're trusting is that Jesus is actually sovereign. And if we can activate God's people in a city, we could actually meet every need in a city. And the degree to which we experience the fullness of Jesus in a city is directly connected with how many people have we activated into their masterpiece mission. So this discovery process, it's this fusion of art and science. So there are assessments. We've created one. It's built around the analogy of GPS, gifts, passion, story. Gifts are your natural abilities, your spiritual gifts. Passion, you've got a cause passion, a people passion, and what we call your influencing passion, which is the leadership matrix from Ephesians 4, apostle, prophet, evangelist, shepherd, teacher. And then the S is story. And our lives are a story that the Holy Spirit is writing. And as people begin to tune in the signal of their gifts, passion, and story, just like with GPS technology, you can figure out not only where you are, but where you're supposed to be, where you're called to be, your calling zone. So what we do is we walk people through these assessments, and then there's this soft side of you're in conversation with the people who know you best. They're reflecting back to you what they see about God's calling in your life. And there's the leadership of the Holy Spirit. There are still burning bushes. There's still moments of divine breakthrough and calling clarity. And our whole posture is not like hey, here's what we can do and you can come help us. It's like, what is Jesus called you to do? And we're here to equip you. So the whole culture of the Kansas City Underground, there are no volunteers. There are no programs. All we have is God's people being activated into their masterpiece mission. And then everybody's called to make disciples wherever they're sent. That's the Great Commission. That's the primary mission we all have. But within that, you also have a personal mission or personal calling. So it's something we're radically committed to. It's just something that is a part of our culture, personal calling, discovery, and deployment. And it's a huge gap in the local church. Most churches they have a volunteer recruitment system. And there is no real calling, discovery, or deployment process. And that's a major shift. But I'm beginning to see some really encouraging transition in that area. There's more and more local churches that are realizing, volunteerism can actually be a subset of personal calling. But personal calling very rarely is a subset of volunteerism. Like 2 or 3% maybe will find their calling within a volunteer system of a local church. You know what I'm saying? You guys get what I'm getting at?
Totally. How long is the discovery? You said discovery process to really go through the GPS, help people discover the personal calling, the personal mission. Is that and you're doing that now digitally? As a result of COVID, you were doing it digitally, right? So you would testify this stuff can be done digitally.
Absolutely. Yeah. In fact, the way it works is basically we have a hidden web page at our website that we'd send a missionary to. I met talking to a guy today who's an accountant and also soccer coach and really called. He's leading his soccer team like a missionary disciple maker. It's amazing. He's going to go through the personal discovery process. So I'll send him the link and he'll go there and it's all there. It's like he'll take the GPS assessment and we've created a digital platform. It feeds us all of his assessment results. He'll do strength finders. He'll do DISC. He'll do Enneagram. And then we have the personal discovery survey. So it's basically questions and it's not multiple choice. It's basically essays where we ask people to open up about their spiritual health, emotional health, relational health, and financial health. And people get out of it what they put into it. You know, so sometimes people literally put in 8-word answers and it's like, well, I don't have much to work with on that one. But a lot of our missionaries will spend hours actually working on that part of it, you know, of sharing their story. And then we have a team, we pull in all those assessments and it gets put into like a master report. And it starts with a 1-page summary of their calling zone. It's pretty amazing. Like where we take all those assessments and put it into a 1-page summary. And then we begin to walk through the individual assessments and we use all of that to create a one-of-a-kind personalized coaching plan for that missionary. And it's about a year's worth of spiritual direction, actually. And the people on the personal discovery team, we help them basically lead that session identifying 1 or 2 steps, you know, because having kind of a year of resources can be overwhelming. So it's like, don't worry about all of it. Like you'll have this report all year. You can come back to it. And we show them actually how to use the report, like how to come back to it once every couple of weeks. And then we offer to meet with them. Like, hey, we'd love to meet with you again in 4 weeks and debrief the progress you've made. And let's start, you know, identifying the next step in the journey. And so that's how it works.
Is there ever a misfire? Do you misdiagnose? I don't know if that's the right word, but like, oh, wait, it's not this, it's really that. Like, give me a story.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, one of the things we tell people up front is like, hey, what we're hoping is, you know, when you go to the doctor and you're having your eyes checked and they go, is this better? Is this better? Is this better? And they click those different lenses. Like we're telling people, listen, if you think you're going to know everything about your calling, like, oh, there it is. You know, we're like, man, we're hoping this will help you get 2 or 3 clicks clearer because calling usually comes in the process of the going. Instead of like the calling doesn't come in the meeting, reading the assessments usually. Like you get clarity, you get themes, but as you're walking on mission, that's where the Lord confirms the calling and brings greater and greater clarity. And yeah, there's definitely been misfires where, you know, the assessment didn't turn out right, or the way we read their survey didn't turn out right. And we tell people, it's like, hey, this is going to be flawed. It isn't a science, it's an art. But I will say, I think everybody's on the team does it with a real sense of reverence and humility. And I think we set the expectations in the work of the Holy Spirit and also kind of long-term obedience in the same direction. Not like, hey, you're going to know everything at the end of this 2-hour debrief, Does that make sense? I mean, is that what you're getting at?
That's the beauty of digital with all of this too, is that we don't really have a lot of infrastructure to keep a machine running. So we don't have the volunteer pieces that, a physical church would have. And so you now have to make a decision. What's the point? Is the point content or is the point equipping? And then, obviously the majority of us on digital, it's about equipping. And so we don't have to wrestle with that nearly as much from a digital platform perspective as somebody who has a mortgage and is in a physical location in a community. Not that those things are bad. I think those things are good. Those are going to shift. But from the very beginning, we can focus on what is it like to equip people for mission.
100%. And once people discover and really start getting clarity on their masterpiece mission, they walk in the power of the Holy Spirit. They're internally motivated. And which is way different than like, oh man, I've got 150 volunteer slots I need to fill. And I really hope I can motivate everybody to get in there and fill them up. And that can really feel like a grind. I've been there where you're just like, oh man, this never ends. And I'm all for those programs within the life of the church. But if those become the end zone, we will have accidentally domesticated God's people and maybe actually really delayed them from getting to their masterpiece mission, And that was the revelation that hit me, maybe 10 years ago, where I was like, whoa, I didn't mean for this to happen, but I've realized we've created a ministry or mission mobilization pathway that just dead ends into a cul-de-sac called the church, like the church program, and Lord, I didn't mean to do this. Like I really did want people on mission. So how do we, change the end zone of this thing from church programs to actually, and not just like, well, now we're going to send them to the Homeless Center to volunteer there. That's kind of what the next step a lot of churches do. It's like, we got to get people on mission. So now we're going to get them in a program in another nonprofit in another building somewhere. And it's like, well, that's good. We do need to do that actually. But what we ultimately need to do is realize Jesus in his genius has given everyone a masterpiece mission. And if we activate them and equip them, that's how we're actually going to get the job done.
So we're helping people find personal calling. We're getting them activated. We're getting them on mission. At what level does that now? You mentioned the word missionaries earlier to term these people. You've got missionaries in South Kansas City, Southwest Kansas City, and you've got them all over Kansas City. Thank you very much. The reach of the internet going beyond what you can do in physical. I'm just saying that.
It's true. We've got 3 hubs now that have launched. And I know it's connected to this kind of digital spread.
Talk to me a little bit, because for me, the question I wanted to ask was like, how do you multiply? So you've got a missionary. How does that missionary become 2 missionaries in microspace? In digital space, you're working with an influencer. How does that influencer become 2 influencers? Like, how do we multiply this idea? Rob, you told me, and I'm famous. I quote you every time. You got to start at the beginning. DNA level 1 has to be multiply. You have to have multiplication set from the beginning. So I know you got a strategy. What does that look like? Maybe in a more practical sense. And I know you're going to get there. How do agencies fit in?
Yeah. So, we have what we call our Missionary Pathway. And it's this equipping pathway to help ordinary folks become loving missionaries. And for us missionaries, like it's someone who's planting themselves deep into like a neighborhood or an affinity group and really learning how to love their neighbor well. And then also how to pay attention to what God is doing and join him. And so they plant themselves, plant the gospel, and then they make disciples. And then what happens is disciples begin to you add disciples, and then eventually, if you keep adding, multiplication can happen. And so phase 1 of the missionary pathway is extraordinary prayer and fasting. Phase 2 is live as a missionary. Phase 3 is plant the gospel. Phase 4 is a microchurch emerges. And then phase 5 is multiplication. Now, we actually overlap phase 5 and phase 1 because you bake in multiplication from the very beginning. So what I mean there, you bake in multiplication in a number of ways. So one is you start in prayer and you're praying from the very beginning for the kind of multiplicative spread of the gospel. Then you're trying to multiply prayer. You know, like today, I found out this week, this is so exciting. Like in the last, I'd say, I think it's 4 months, we've doubled the number of people that are praying and fasting on Tuesdays. That's multiplication, man. Like it's not times 20, but it's times 2, and I'll take it. You know, and that means we have twice the amount of force in the heavenlies. You know what I mean? And then you have to multiply then people who are living as missionaries. That's phase 2. And the way that happens is it's a ground war. You know, like the way I describe it, a couple quick stories, like I use these exponential, like Corey, this guy was volunteering in the jail system, started having spiritual conversations with the guy who was a person of peace, starts a Discovery Bible study with him. This guy meets Jesus through the Discovery Bible study. Corey didn't say, now bring all your friends to my Discovery Bible study. He said, you're going to start a Discovery Bible study with your buddies, you know, and I'm going to equip you to do that. And guess what? Vincent did. And then guess what Vincent did? The buddies he led to Christ, he's like, you guys are going to start a new Discovery Bible study. Like he did what Corey showed him to do, right? And in a matter of months, there was a Discovery Bible study in every pod in that jail system. You know, because we're teaching people from the very beginning, this is what we do. Like when you do Discovery Bible study, you know, the last question is who are you going to share this with? You're building in multiplication, reproduction. Like when we teach people a new tool in the missionary pathway, part of our teaching is, who can you teach this to this week? Like you take simple practices. So it starts with a mindset and it starts with prayer, and then you turn it into simple practices. And eventually it becomes cultural, you know, so it's got to be in your mind. It's got to be in your prayers. It's got to be in your language, and it's got to be built into your tools and your training. And eventually it becomes normal. Like people just go, this is just what it means to be a follower of Jesus. Like you obey and you share and you equip and you multiply. And, you know, we've seen that, you know, in our neighborhood too, where, you know, we've got, families that now are following Jesus, and, a couple of those families are now like official missionaries in the underground, you know, like they signed the missionary covenant, you know. I was like, yeah, you know. So we went from, you know, we tripled the number of missionaries and went from 2 to 6. And then there's 9 families that are following Jesus, and I know more of them will become missionaries. You know what I'm saying? It's just a matter of time. So that's how we do it, man. It's not complicated. It actually is pretty simple. And that's the good news. Anybody can do this.
Chesley, I know you love this philosophy. What does that look like, you know, as you're planning this church, King City, and moving forward with that? Like, what does multiplication look like for you with King City?
Yeah, for me, as I'm getting the word out, and, you know, we have the podcast, I've been on social, we're starting to get people in that are saying, hey, this is resonating with me, and I would like to be a part of that. well, you got to have the steps, you got to have the pathway. And so, if you have eyes, plagiarize, right? So, so I just took like what Rob and Brian and a guy named Bruce, and like, I'm like, hey, let's not try to reinvent the wheel. Let's do what's been done for, decades, generations before us to help equip the church. And so, we're taking those systems and we're running through those with them so that they can become a missionary in their own context. I'm a brand nut. I like marketing, so we don't call it missionaries; we call them city builders. But we don't.
That's actually great. That's a great brand, brother. And we're actually having a conversation about if missionary can actually be our phrase long term, or if it's going to be problematic. So.
Yeah, for me, I'm trying to rid myself of the connotations of all the church words that have been out there. Evangelical used to be a theological construct, but I can't go online and say I'm an evangelical. That would be a bad day. So, from a theological perspective, that what that term used to mean, I am that, but not from a present day cultural perspective. I am not that. So, and their terms win the day because I'm trying to reach them. And so I've got to create some terms some terminology that's not politically loaded. And so, King City, I'm not trying to say we're a church. We're a church to everybody inside the church. But King City is just King City. We're a bunch of people that love Jesus and coming. And I'm not trying to deconstruct the whole emerging church movement back from the early 2000s. That's not what we're trying to do. At the end of the day, we are trying to make sure that we create an environment that outside people will say, yeah, I want to be a part of that. Yeah, I want to learn how to do that. And City Builders made sense to us. It falls in line with the King City brand. Anybody can be anybody can be a city builder. I don't have to say leader because, my Enneagram 9 wife, like, I'm not a leader. It's like, well, you can be a city builder, and she gets that. She can hang out with her moms that have kids. So it's shifting the language.
It reminds me of, Jeremiah's prophetic call to God's people, where he's like, build homes and plant gardens and work for the shalom of the city. And there's this image, in the book of Revelation of like, come out of Babylon, but, and that's important. There's ways that we do need to come out of Babylon, but there's also this image of like, Jeremiah's like, build a city within the city, basically. Like, build Zion inside of Babylon. And as that city flourishes, the whole city will flourish.
You're stealing stealing all my branding, bro. It's all from Nehemiah. So yeah,
it's so compelling, man.
We're building up Zion, and as we're building Zion, Babylon will flourish as a result of it. Let me ask this. Okay, so we want to activate missionaries or city builders or whatever the term is. We are
missional leaders.
Missional leaders, love that. So we want to create missional leaders. Now, there's people listening to the podcast. Now, some audience is digital only, and so I let's say digital only church planners, digital only churches. I think there's a clear path towards creating these missional leaders and empowering them to be the missional leaders within their digital and or physical or both contexts. So like, I think that path is clear. We got to figure out the how. I'm going to go sleep on Rob Wagner's couch one day, get all the secrets, and we'll figure out how to do digital. It's going to be awesome. But there's another person that's in the audience here that I want to, let's just pay an homage to. Yeah, so there are people that we're currently, call them staff, call them high-level volunteers, high-level leaders in established churches that maybe are operating on a different model than what Rob Chesley, what we've been talking about here today. Maybe it's not a lead from the second chair position. Maybe it's a tech director, digital pastor that's got marching orders. Or there's an elder board somewhere that's not a fan. Like, we've all heard stories in this mid-post-COVID season, so we know who we're talking about. What advice do you give to these people? You see the world differently. It's not a biblical. You mentioned it earlier. It's not necessarily a biblical model, but that doesn't mean that it's bad. What advice would you give to somebody that wants to get to this becoming a missional leader or resourcing a movement like this, but just isn't at that right church right now?
I would say the Lord will honor you as you honor, as best you can, the leadership that you're currently serving with. And so I just encourage you to try to be a person who finds meaningful ways to establish your credibility through faithful service. And I assume most people that are listening, they've already done that. I just mentioned that because, if you're kind of like the the armchair quarterback, like church leaders get that all the time, so just make sure you're really in the game. And I'm assuming, that's who you're talking about. People that are in the game, they're serving, they're helping, they're contributing. Try to do a gentle, invitation to that, the person who's got kind of the decision making power. Like, hey, let's read a book together. Or, hey, would you be willing to watch this webinar with me? To give them some exposure to what is possible. And try to see if you can secure just enough permission to do some experiments. Don't try to propose sweeping change. Basically say, hey, can we just create a little R&D project over here on the side? And I just want to start with 10 or 15 people. And I don't need much budget. And I would like to report in monthly what's happening. And try to build the new alongside the old. Because actually the practice of the new, the embodiment of the new is the best critique of the old. Now you have to go into eyes wide open, because sometimes you do that and it's fruitful and it still doesn't convert people. There's a paradigm blindness. And if you find that's true, if you actually run the experiment and you've had good results and you are faithfully reporting them back and you find that it's not welcomed and you're called to it, it's probably time to begin to pray about what's next. It's like, because that was something that happened to my wife and I. We had been in this church for 22 years and we had got a ton of permission to run all these experiments, and we did. And it was like amazing fruit, but it was clear institutionally for that church, it was never going to be an A priority. It was going to be a B, probably a C priority. But for Michelle and I, it was like, well, this is our calling. This is an A priority for us. And it was heartbreaking. It was difficult, but it was like, this isn't the place for us. And that's okay, And you have to know when to do that. Like, you have to have the courage to trust God's call in your life and go, okay. So that's what I'd recommend. And I'm recommending it because that's what I did. And I felt like God actually has honored that.
Jeff, that's exactly what I did too. So in the beginning of this process, I was a youth and young adult pastor, and I saw I saw everything that I've been thinking for 5 years come to fruition with COVID. And so I went to my pastor, a church that's been around, for 50 plus years. And I said, hey, I think we should try this. Jesus says, don't put new wine into old wineskins. Otherwise you'll lose both the wineskin and the wine. And so it's like, let's do something new alongside, but let's not try to kill the old in the process, because there's still people that we've got to care for on both sides. And it's just a completely new paradigm. And so I will say this, I'm not trying to be controversial, but I know it will be. You're called to die for Jesus, not a corporation. And at the end of the day, you honor and you care. But if God's called you to do something, you don't have to work at a church to make disciples. You can get out of your office, go to your local coffee shop, do Luke 10 on a day-to-day basis and begin to start making disciples there. Grab some of Rob and Brian's stuff, grab some of Bruce Bugby's stuff to help equip people for the work of the ministry, learning how to do character and calling and and equipping people with their gifts of the Spirit. Do that on your own time. I know in church, they don't hire you to be a good Christian. They hire you to run an organization, but start being a good Christian on your off moments. Go start making disciples when you're not on the clock, and God will honor that too. And if it's time to move, it's time to move. Don't try to burn bridges along the way, though.
It's funny. We're gonna that part of the conversation actually hit very much close to home. I haven't publicly said this in the podcast. Actually, doing a podcast with Ray in a little bit, but Ray stepped out of his job. Ray resigned from Ray DeArmas, co-host here at the Church Digital podcast. If you listen, you know Ray, and he's going to be on a podcast talking about this. He stepped down at digital pastor at Christ Fellowship Miami. And the heart of why he did it, he spent 4 years getting his master's of divinity. So he spent 4 years of his life. He's in his early 30s. He's 10% of his life to getting a degree to go be the pastor. And he's going back to school to spend 2 years studying to become a medical technician to be a nurse. Or excuse me, a medical technician, not a nurse. The heart of this, Ray feels like his mission field is now a hospital. Ray feels called to become the missionary, to be the influencer missionally at a hospital that he gets assigned to. That's where his calling is taking him. And so he resigned from a digital pastor church job following his heart to do ministry effectively, to build relationships in a hospital. And there are people, when I tell that story, there are people like, that is the coolest thing that I've ever heard. By the way, I can probably tell you a half dozen other stories like that in recent months where people are stepping away from full-time staff jobs to go after the idea of missionally, relationally connecting with people and taking jobs. A good friend of mine, just took a job as a realtor because he wanted to spend more time meeting people. He's still doing ministry. He's still doing a microchurch movement. He's just doing another job so they can relationally meet people that aren't already attending a church. And so I think you're seeing more and more of those. And I think that's going to be more and more a topic here on this podcast, as it's just even trying to figure out how we can influence these people, how we can help people gain their influence and maybe even discover what their personal calling, what their personal mission is. So listen, I've loved this conversation. This has been great. Hey, Chesley, real quick, landing the plane. Any closing thoughts on your side?
Make disciples. It doesn't take much to step out of the boat. You don't have much to lose. To go and be around people that need Jesus. The paradigms are different, yes, from physical church to digital church and everything that Rob's talking about. But at the end of the day, if you'll step out of the boat and meet people where they're at, the Holy Spirit will show up, and it'll be more rewarding than the last year sitting in a cubicle.
Love it. Rob, any closing thoughts while we're landing the plane here?
I'm grateful for the work you guys are doing, and that you're bringing the centrality of Jesus and his mission into the digital space. Thank you, guys. And I'm learning a lot from you.
Awesome. Hey, yeah, it's Rob. It is always a pleasure to have you around. Starfish and the Spirit, unleashing the leadership potential of churches and organizations. So thankful for this book. Love the Starfish and the Spider, like you said, 15 years ago, and unpacking and applying this towards a church realm is awesome. Creating movements of people on personal calling to become missional leaders is more awesome. So thank you for that. Thank you for setting a standard here that are allowing, to be completely blunt, digital churches to have meaning and purpose beyond broadcasting just on Sunday. Okay, maybe God is providing the purpose, but you are paving the road so that digital churches can follow suit with that. So, hey, we're going to wrap right here. This has been great. For Chesley, for Rob, this is Jeff at the Church Digital, State of Church Planning. Thanks for joining us here at the pod, and we'll see you next time on the show. You have a good day.